play-by-mail. These days I always hear young people talking about how difficult modern games such as Bloodborne and Dark Soul can be. If you asked me, I say they have no idea what they are even talking about. Back in my day, you couldn't just watch a Twitch video of a better player expertly navigating his or her way through a level. We didn't even know if beating Mike Tyson was humanly possible. The water level in Ninja Turtles? Nobody in my neighborhood could get past it, and everyone in my neighborhood had a Nintendo. Games of yesteryear were seemingly impossible, and us gamers needed all the help we could get just to survive. From magazines, to game genies, to even TV game shows like Video Power. And speaking of a magazine, there were always the Nintendo game counselors listed in the holy gaming bible that was Nintendo Power magazine. Their seemingly endless gaming knowledge was just a phone call away for a price, of course. Hey, you had to be willing to pay if you wanted to be the best. One night, my friend Ron J slept over at my house and we planned to figure out where we were supposed to go next in Willow. Naturally, we don't have a YouTube video to guide us, so we bust out the Nintendo Powers, looking for maps and tips and anything that could basically give us an edge in the game Willow, which was of course based on the classic movie Willow. We loved the movie, so we just had to beat this game, but we needed a tip or two unless we wanted to spend the night wandering around in circles and accomplishing nothing. I was looking at some maps and plotting a course in our sticker-covered notebook while Ranjay was looking at some random issue of, you guessed it, Nintendo Power magazine. Out of nowhere he says, "What on God's green earth are play-by-mail games?" And I had to admit that I had absolutely no idea. Maybe they would send you video games in the mail? We both agreed that that would be bad, which, believe it or not, is how young people used to say, "Excellent, we had to get these play-by-mail games." One of the Nintendo game counselors had listed play-by-mail games as one of his hobbies. His name was Derek Whipple, and it said his favorite game was Nobunaga's Ambition, a game neither Ranjay nor myself had ever even heard of, but we called the hotline and asked if we could speak to a counselor about it. When we were connected to a counselor, I immediately asked if I was speaking to Derek Whipple. He chuckled and asked if we saw his listing in Nintendo Power. I immediately changed the subject to play-by-mail games. "How can we get these games in the mail, Derek?" I asked, but he just laughed and explained it was more like playing chess and you just sent a short letter explaining your next move and then waited for a reply. We were totally bummed at how lame this sounded, but Derek Whipple was, shall we say, very enthusiastic and kept going on about it. He explained that you could also play role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons by mail, and that it was actually really fun. He gave us his personal address, which I'm pretty sure was against the rules of being a game counselor, but he just laughed and told me to send him my character sheet with my stats and stuff. I wrote down his address and told him I would send it out this weekend. "Don't forget to put your return address on the envelope," he said right before I hung up. Ranjay and I stayed up that night creating a cool character called Wizron Pippin, who was basically just Scottie Pippen as a wizard, but he could shoot flaming basketballs and had high tops made of dragon scales. We drew a picture and included all of his stats and powers and then put it in an envelope that I mailed to Derek Whipple. Weeks passed and I forgot all about it. Then I got a letter in the mail. I was sitting at the dinner table doing my homework when I hear my mom say, "Wizron Pippin?" And I jumped up and snatched it from her and ran into my bedroom. I was so excited. Inside, Derek had left some instructions for how to play a role-playing game by mail, and then the beginning of my adventure, which said something like, "You are in a rectangular room, there are 2 doors and a window, there's a chest on one wall," etc. Derek's instructions had recommended drawing out a map of the dungeon or wherever Wizron Pippin was supposed to be. So I got out the old notebook and drew the room as it was described. I immediately wrote a reply stating my intentions to explore the room and exit the door facing north. I put it in the mailbox that night. It was a fun experience and gave me something to look forward to receiving in the mail other than Nintendo Power, of course. Derek's reply would come about a week after I sent mine and involved hordes of strange monsters and fabulous treasures. Every weekend I would show Ranjay an update on Wizron Pippin's adventures, and eventually he was demanding that I allow him to help me make decisions. One night we had the map and all our notes strewn about the floor of my room when my mom came in to bring us some of her famous Sloppy Joe paninis, and she glances at the papers in my room. "Are you making a map of our house? That's cute," she says as she leaves. Ranjay and I stared at each other wild-eyed for a moment, then slowly we both looked at the dungeon map. We picked up the map and walked around. It was my house. It started in my bedroom, had the long walk-in closet that led to a spare room. It even had most of the rooms upstairs, even though I had not yet finished exploring yet. "Wait, did you draw a map for him?" Ranjay asked, fear trembling in his voice. "I didn't tell him anything. He's been telling me what to draw on the map." We tried calling the Nintendo Power hotline again asking about Nobunaga's ambition, but this time we got some lady. Is Derek Whipple working today?" I asked. There was a long pause, and I could hear her talking to someone while covering the receiver of the phone. Finally, she said, "Derek doesn't work here anymore. May I ask what this is about?" That's when I hung up. I was a little freaked out, but I was also 10 and didn't know how to respond. What exactly was my problem? It was hard to explain. I wrote one final letter to Derek Whipple regarding the adventures of Wizron Pippin and never received a response. All it said was, "Derek, have you been inside my house?" Strange instructions. One of my favorite games as a kid was Monster Party, a Nintendo game where you were a boy named Mark who had his trusty baseball bat but could also take pills to transform into a dragon named Bert. It was a strange game. At one point you have to fight evil onion rings that come out of the transporter from The Fly starring Jeff Goldblum. What more could a kid in the early 90s ask for? It also was responsible for the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me. I was watching my older brother Brett play, which was exciting because I wasn't that good to be honest, and he always played while wearing sunglasses, which made me feel like I was in a cool movie. He said something like, "Hey Junior, go get me a glass of Squirt." He called me Junior because we had just seen Problem Child, and I looked exactly like the star. Everyone still calls me Junior now that I'm an adult. It's kind of like being a celebrity. I remember coming back with the Squirt, singing the Squirt song that Brett and I had made up. It was just the happy birthday song, but every word and or syllable was replaced with the word squirt, but it was surprisingly catchy. Some of the best songs are very simple, if you think about it. Brett was really upset, and I could tell because his mouth was agape and his sunglasses were perched on his head. He usually never lost his cool when playing and dominating video games, so I was immediately worried. He kept killing these two little zombies on the screen and they kept coming back. "I've been killing them literally since you left to get Squirt," he said. We tried killing the zombie on the left and the right, but it made no difference. We had the password for that level, so he just turned off the game and said, "We need to call a game counselor." For those of you who are too young or uncool to remember, game counselors were professional game players who you could call up and they could tell you any secret or tip to advance in any Nintendo game. They could be found in the pages of Nintendo Power magazine and usually had a mullet. A mullet was an old hairstyle that was short in the front and long in the back. We used to have an expression about them that went, "That is a hairstyle for doing both business and having a party." We asked our parents and they were like, "Who are you going to call and why and how much is this going to cost?" They didn't want us making any long distance calls. Brett says, "Follow me, Junior," and soon we were rummaging through his treasure chest of gaming mags. He is flipping pages like a madman and then suddenly stops and shows me a small ad in the back of one. It was for a discount game counselor number and the area code was the same one as ours. All it said was, "Need help? Game counselors available 24/7. Visa and MasterCard accepted. You get advice or we don't get paid." We ran back to our parents who nervously gave us their credit card. I remember Brett smelled it like it was a fresh-baked bread and said, "Ah, Visa, the good stuff." and then ran to his phone, which was shaped like sexy lady lips, so it was like a giant lady was kissing his face while he talked on the phone. Hey, he was a smooth dude. He didn't want me pressing my ear up against his, so I had to listen in on the Sports Illustrated football phone in my bedroom. By the time I got in there, Brett was already receiving wise advice from a game counselor. Do you have a notebook? I'm going to give you some top secret advice for the game Monster Party, but you will need to write it down. I got my own notebook ready, and I did so excitedly. This was my first time receiving professional video game advice after all. At the title screen, press A, B, 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 A, the counselor said into the phone. I was writing as fast as I could. It was just a long string of A's and B's, but I was used to long, complex button codes on the Nintendo. Finally, the code came to an end. If you entered the code correctly, you should hear a scream from the dungeon, the counselor said. Oh, and to defeat the zombies, you just have to sit and do nothing. It's kind of a joke. Afterwards, you might be given a magic pill that will transform you into Morse the Dragon. Can I help with anything else? Brett was quiet for a few moments, and then he said, No thanks, I think we got it, and hung up. We went back to the basement, both of us with a notebook in one hand and an icy glass of squirt in the other. What was that long-ass code about? He asked. Do we need to do all that to defeat the zombies? If that were the case, this game would be impossible. I agreed, and we started the game up, but went right to the zombies level and tried the doing nothing strategy just as instructed. Eventually, the zombies died on their own. A trick boss level. We received a pill and transformed into Bert the dragon. Why did he call the dragon Morris? I asked. Brett said, he didn't say Morris, he said Morse. Why would someone who knows everything about this game not know the character names? Let's try the code. I have a weird feeling about it. We tried it for like 20 minutes and never heard the scream from the dungeon that we were doing it right. Brett stared at the code in his notebook for a moment and then said, There isn't a dungeon in this game. Look, the first part of this code is SOS in Morse code. He said Morse was the name of the dragon, get it? Go get that nerdy book you have about Morse code. With my book, Brett decoded the rest of the message in a few minutes. It was an address in town, on a road that we sometimes went down on our bikes. Then, as if to clarify the location, it said, Vacant School. We had thrown rocks at some of the windows there before, so we knew exactly where it was. That weekend, we loaded up our backpacks with supplies like cans of squirt and went on a little bike ride to the empty school. We spent a lot of the time just laying in the tall weeds outside, looking at what seemed like an empty building. It was pretty boring at first, but then something happened. We saw a person walking through one of the classrooms on the first floor. They sat down at a desk and began eating lunch or something. We army crawled over to the window and slowly lifted our heads up. I don't remember much about the guy we saw because I was staring through a hole in the window at his satin jacket. At first I thought it had Mario on the front, but it looked homemade. Mario had a skinny, kind of sinister look to his face, and instead of a mushroom, he was holding a handgun. Also, Mario's hair was all blonde like a scary Larry Bird. The man saw us immediately and yelled, Hey, come here! Which startled us so bad we ran back to our bikes. As we were mounting our bikes, some sort of siren started to wail and we just looked at each other as if to say, oh shit, and then pedaled full throttle until we got home. I think I chugged 2 cans of squirt out of pure exhaustion. We talked about what had happened and how it was connected to the local game counseling hotline, but we had no idea. They demolished that school a year later, and there was some strange article about how someone had paid the utilities bills for like 5 years in advance, and it wasn't clear who had done so or why. Maybe only Brett and I had any idea at all, but we never said anything until now. Has anyone ever seen this gun-toting, skinny blonde Mario logo? I feel like it must be some sort of underground organized crime syndicate or something. I just hope that game counselor we talked to is okay, but I think he is actually dead already. I've always thought of myself as being, shall we say, far beyond average when it comes to video games, but when I was younger, I would get frustrated and then have to consult the pros. Back in the day, there was no internet, so we had to actually make a phone call to people whose job it was just to play video games all day and give useful advice to us. Hey, how do I get that job? I actually called game counselors a lot. After I broke literally every controller in the house in frustration, basically because of the birds in Ninja Gaiden, my parents said I could call any time if it would calm me down. I'm not sure if they misinterpreted the game counselor for game therapist and thought I was getting advice on dealing with my anger or something when playing games, but they let me call whenever I wanted, and I took advantage of this situation. However, now I wish I had never called, because that is how I somehow let Gary into my life. The first time I spoke to game counselor Gary was when I was playing Maniac Mansion sometime in 1989. I had picked up a ton of items in the game and had no idea where or how to even use any of them, though. I was convinced that I had to somehow fix the staircase that was out of order, so I asked Gary what item I needed. He immediately launched into this tirade where he was like, "Tony, I get a lot of young gamers who think they know the path they are on, but they can't achieve their dreams because their goal is an illusion." "What?" I said. I called for game tips and tricks, not a confusing Confucius giving me personal advice. Also, I was 9 years old. He explained that the staircase was just a distraction and was never used in the game. I asked him what each item I had collected was used for, and he told me. It was really helpful. I thanked him, ready to hang up and return to the game, when he said, "I'm always here for you, Tony." That really creeped me out, and I just hung up the phone. Had I ever even said my name? The next weekend, I'm playing games in my room when my mom pops her head in and says, "Hey, Tone, you got a phone call from one of your gaming counselors." It took me a second to process what she just said. That wasn't a thing that happened. I was a dumb kid, so instead of communicating this, I just said, "Oh, okay," and went into our kitchen to take the call. It was Gary. "Tony, I just wanted to check in with one of my gamers who I think was struggling and maybe on the wrong track. I gave you a lot of information, and I just want to be sure you're putting it to good use. Have you made significant progress in Maniac Mansion?" I remember wanting to ask how he got the number, but I think I just thought that there were so many things about the adult world that I didn't understand, and this was probably one of them. I told him I had made progress, but I hadn't finished. He gave me more advice on the game and then added, "Just remember that a winner doesn't do drugs and he eats a healthy diet. I tell all my gamers this fact about the human body. I have personally discovered that eating greasy foods like pizza will slow down your reaction time when playing games like Double Dribble or Chubby Cherub." He went on like that for a while. I remember pressing the phone to my ear and looking down the hallway for my parents, and then looking out our kitchen window and thinking it was so dark outside. "Do you promise?" Gary asked. I had no idea what he had just said, but it was probably about eating vegetables or staying in school or something, so I said, "Yeah, I promise." Gary continued to call me about once a month after that. He would always ask what I was playing, give some random advice about the game, and then tried to tie in a life lesson. The game advice was always helpful, even when I told him I was playing checkers with my grandma. The life advice usually just went over my head. It wasn't that weird to me as a 9-year-old, because I had no idea that this wasn't something that game counselors, or really any adults, ever did. A year later, we moved to another state and got a new phone number. The calls from Counselor Gary stopped for about 5 months. Then the phone rang while I was eating a late-night bowl of Urkelos cereal. I said, "Hello?" and then I heard Gary's rambling. "Tony, when you're playing Bart versus the Space Mutants, you can use cherry bombs and bottle rockets to scare purple birds away. I always tell my gamers that fireworks should only be used under adult supervision. You need those fingers to manipulate the game controller to play games like Mickey Mousecapades, so don't blow them off." I was super confused and a little scared. "How did you get our new number, Gary?" There was a long pause on the other end. "Don't worry about that. Just keep gaming and I'll be here when you need me." This phone call creeped me out. I decided it was time to tell my parents about Gary and how he kept calling me, and I was pretty sure I never gave him either my phone number or my name, so what was happening? They were terrified and angry and called the police immediately. The police traced the call and said it was coming from a payphone in our town. My parents bought a bunch of locks and bulletproof windows and told me to let them answer the phone from now on. The calls kept coming in. I would sometimes hear my dad cursing into the phone at Gary, who apparently kept calling from different payphones around town. Had he always lived here and we just coincidentally moved to the same town? Even as a kid, I thought that was unlikely. No matter how many times we changed our number, the calls kept coming throughout my childhood. In the early 2000s, I moved out of my parents' house and got an apartment. I decided that I didn't want to have a landline because I had developed kind of a phobia, but for some reason I thought it would be safe to get a cellular telephone. I was wrong. One evening I got a call from an unknown number, so I let it go to voicemail. It was Gary. He said something like, "Only Bernard and Jeff can repair the telephone in Maniac Mansion. Otherwise you can't call the Meteor Police. I always tell my gamers that learning how to fix things around the house, blah blah blah." I saved the voicemail but could not listen to the entire thing. I called the police and tried to explain the situation, but they just thought I was being pranked by a friend or something. "Is the person threatening you in any way?" I thought about it for a second, and then said, "No, actually they are giving me advice for video games, and also kind of life coaching me, but I don't want them to call me anymore. This has been happening since I was 9. They said that I should explain how I felt to Gary, and if he continued to harass me, then they would look into it. The next time Gary called, I immediately interrupted him. "Look, Gary, I don't even play Nintendo games anymore. Also, I'm an adult and I don't need your lame life advice." Gary was quiet for a few seconds and then said, "It's dangerous to go alone. In The Legend of Zelda, find the old man in the graveyard by pushing on the tombstones." I hung up and called the police, but of course they wouldn't help me. Of course, the call was coming from a payphone somewhere locally. Of course it was. For the next 10 years, I basically just stopped listening to my voicemail and I never answered a call from an unknown number. I continued to get them frequently, and my voicemail was always full, so I wasn't even sure how many new messages I was getting. Problem solved. I moved into a house last year to accommodate our growing family and had not had to deal with Gary in quite some time. I still mentioned him to people as it made a great weird story, but I didn't think too much about it. A few months ago, I decided to check my phone log. It was pretty clear that I was now receiving new monthly calls from one number in particular that was from my new area code. Payphones don't really exist anymore, so I was curious about where Gary could be calling me from these days. I decided to call it. Maybe I could keep Gary on the line long enough and then have the police finally track down my lifetime harasser. I hit call back and heard the phone ringing. I heard the digitized phone sound from my phone, but I also heard something outside. My neighbor's phone was ringing. Both of our windows were open. I saw a silhouette behind the curtain next door, very large, and then almost simultaneously, I heard the phone stop ringing next door as Gary said, "Oh, hi, Tony. Did you know that by holding the jump button you can ride on the bubble in Bubble Bobble? This technique will allow you to access places you never dreamed were accessible before." I hung up the phone and stared out the window. Our houses are very close. The silhouette just stood there, like it was staring at me through the curtain. It didn't move. Had I ever seen our neighbors in that house? Now I wasn't sure. I think they were extremely old and frail and couldn't really leave the house. There was a new car in the driveway. Maybe this was an aide or someone like that. I slowly closed the window, watching the mysterious, unmoving shadow next door the whole time. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? I called someone who might be my neighbor, who might be a game counselor, who has been giving me advice over the phone since I was 9? Yeah, right. Now, I receive a call at least once a day. I never answer them. I'm still waiting to see what our neighbor looks like, but he never leaves the house. I see him moving around in there at night, though, and I can sometimes hear his telephone ringing.
Don't forget to subscribe, and remember, true pastas are the scariest pastas.